Okay, good afternoon and welcome to this Rights of Light webinar. I'm David Radcliffe, Director of Building Surveying at AA Projects. I hope you're all keeping well. It's been difficult times recently. This, by the way, is not my office. I'm sat in somewhere else, but I would actually like to be somewhere like that. These are just backgrounds provided by Zoom. So go back to that one. So at AA Projects, I cover all the professional work, which is rights of light, party walls, boundary disputes, access and oversailing negotiations and agreements, expert witness, anything to do with a new development. Plus, expert witness seems to be a big thing at the moment, particularly with cladding. But today we're going to cover rights of light. Just a few things quickly about Zoom. I'm not sure how familiar you are with Zoom, but at the bottom of your screen, if you hover near the bottom, you should see a symbol for raising the hand, a chat icon and Q&A. Please feel free to ask questions as we go along in the Q&A typed box, and I will pick up on them as we go along and hopefully answer them at any appropriate stage, or at the end I might try letting people speak to ask questions by people raising the hand, but maybe only do that at the end. During the webinar, there will be a couple of polls that I will launch, a couple of questions that I feel are really important at the moment. I'll be interested to hear other people's views on how they feel about the questions I've raised once you've heard some of what I've got to say. And if you do want a copy of the webinar presentation that I'm going through at the moment, please do let me know either on the Q&A thing or by email, and we'll happily send them around to everybody. So just a quick example of some of the work we work on. We're working on a big tower at the moment. I think it's nearing completion. And this raised some of the major issues that you would encounter working on big scale development. And it covered just about everything I've come across. So interesting example, it was a site with an old building on it, and we had to demolish the existing building, which raised party wall issues, exposing party walls, that sort of thing. When we were looking to develop a new building, there was a T-Mobile mobile telephone mast on the adjacent property, and our tower would block the signal coming from it. And interestingly, to put that mobile telephone mast in, they put the cables on the gable wall of the adjacent property, which oversailed the development site, and we were building up against that, so we had to get those cables removed. Interesting negotiations with T-Mobile, or EE as it's now. It was a fully enclosed site, so there was a lot of temporary oversails for scaffold and crane, and then for window cleaning later there was a permanent BMU oversail agreement, and also obviously daylight sunlight planning and rights of light. So today I'm going to cover the definition of a right of light, how you might acquire one, prevention of acquisition, extinguishment of a right of light once it exists, and if you do alter those windows when they have already acquired a right of light, what might happen after that. Measurement of adequate light, because adequate light is indeed what a right of light is, or more commonly known as sufficient light. If you do experience a right of light infringement, how you might value that in terms of damages, remedies available, injunctions, and then towards the end we'll cover recent cases and a bit of a summary. As I say, please ask questions with the controls at the bottom, and we might do a raise hand session near the end. Okay, so definition. There is no statutory definition of a right of light, really. If you Google it, you'll find all sorts of examples of how it works, but ultimately it is decided through case law over hundreds of years. Some of the leading cases that we quote, an example would be Coles versus Home and Colonial Stores, 1904. Home and Colonial Stores were building a new shop opposite the Coles basement workshop, and Coles thought he had lost enough light to warrant a rights of light infringement. Case went to court. The judge said that Mr. Coles had not experienced a rights of light infringement because he still had sufficient light for normal purposes having regard to the ordinary notions of mankind. And that was largely what was the basis for how rights of light are considered. After a development, do you still have sufficient light left for normal purposes? That was a very grey, broad brush definition, and Percy Waldron in 1928 tried to put figures on what sufficient light for normal purposes was. And I'll cover that in more detail as to what that actually means. But even though they are very historic cases, both of those, you do see them quoted in recent cases, including Regan versus Ball Properties 2006, which I'll cover later. There is a great rights of light debate ongoing at the moment as to whether the methods that were devised by Percy Waldron in 1928 are actually still relevant in today's standards. And I think everybody has their own opinions on that, and some quite strongly. There's some leading books that have been written about the subject. And in one of the most recent cases, Beaumont Business Centres Limited versus Florala, the defendants tried to argue that different measures of light should be used, but the judge dismissed it and said that the old measures are a good guide as to whether infringement is caused or not. So we're still stuck with them. In terms of how to acquire a right of light, people sometimes know they've acquired a right of light and put, by example of that picture, little signs below windows saying that they know they have a right of light. Might seem a bit extreme, but my guess is, and I don't know the particular site, but my guess is that there is a development site not too far away, and they are looking to protect their interests. And if that did go to court, the judge would be able to say to the developer, you clearly were aware those windows had a right of light, and the owner of those windows could possibly obtain the most severest protection of their rights of light. So how do you acquire? Main ways by way of Prescription Act 1832, but there are also various other ways, such as lost modern grant, express grant, legal agreements, principles in Wilden versus Borough, non-derogation from grant. I'll just cover each one very quickly. Prescription Act 1832, you've got to prove 20 years continuous enjoyment of light through a window aperture. The light must have been enjoyed, so if during that 20-year period you choose to block up your window, then you're not enjoying the light, and therefore that will defeat the 20 years. And by continuous, we mean that any interruption hasn't got to have been any greater than a year. So you could have, for example, a piece of scaffolding and a hoarding that goes up in front of a window, which is there for 6 months. That will not stop the 20-year period. But if it was there for over a year, the light that blocks out would be an interruption, and the 20-year period when that scaffolding comes down will be set back to zero and would have to be accrued again. For new buildings, it's when the building is structurally complete, i.e. the window apertures are formed. It's not when the building is completely finished, it's not when it's occupied, etc. It's when the window apertures were complete, which is important for when we're dating rights of light acquisition. And when an action is brought, you need to show it was the last 20 years back from the date of action rather than any 20 years. And importantly, rights can be acquired by tenants, and I'll give you a good example of a tenant acquiring rights later on. Other ways, lost modern grant, very similar to Prescription Act, 20 years uninterrupted enjoyment, but it's not statute, it's actually a principle based on case law. Legal agreement, often when parcels of land were separated years ago and sold to other individuals, the owner of the big parcel of land would often say in a legal agreement and the deed of sale that you can't build over, say, 7 stories if I sell this land to you. And that serves as a restriction going forward. I mentioned leases where you can acquire a right of light, and you can acquire rights almost instantly through that legal agreement. And a good example is Frogmore Developments versus Shurama Shockerson in 1997. And in that case, Shurama Shockerson was planning a 2-phase development, and in phase 1 is going to complete it, put Frogmore Developments in there, and start phase 2. And that's exactly what he did. But when he started phase 2, his tenant brought a right of light claim against him, and that was because in his lease it said that he had the right to the free and uninterrupted passage of light and air at all times, and that served as an immediate right. And the Frogmore Developments were successful in preventing their landlord from starting on phase 2. Principle of Wilden versus Burrows is if you have a big piece of land and you sell off part, that the person buying the bit that you sell off will immediately acquire a right of light over your retained parts, unless you say specifically that they don't. And non-derogation from grant is that if you do sell a piece of land for a particular purpose, it may involve, for example, light, and then you own land around it and start to take away from the light that it enjoys, the courts may stop you because you're derogating from those grounds. Okay, that's how acquire, very briefly and quickly. How do you prevent someone acquiring a right of light? Well, I gave you a clue in what I've just said, and what we've got are things called spike fences. And in this picture here, you've got a mansion block and a property at the back, and around the property at the back is a big fence that's been erected. And the purpose of that fence is to create a 1-year interruption to the Prescription Act acquisition of light. So what the mansion block owner would do is erect that fence, leave it there for 12 months, maybe after 90 years or just before 19 years, leave it there for a year, classed as a 1-year interruption, take the fence down, the 20-year period is set back to 0, and if you do that every 19 years, that property in the background overlooking the mansion block grounds will never acquire a right of light. And that's another simple example. That big fence in the background, even though it's a very historic picture, is actually a spike fence, rather than keeping cattle in or anything like that. In 1959 or thereabouts, the government became quite fed up of people erecting spike fences, so they brought in the Rights of Light Act. Not really about rights of light, it's all about how you might prevent someone acquiring rights of light over your land, and it's a paper-based form of erecting what's called a spike fence. So what you do is you get your light obstruction notice, you fill it in as you need to. This is just brief details of what you need to do. And then you attach a drawing or plans setting out the 2 parcels of land, and you state how big and where you want your fence to be, usually of infinite height, on the boundary of your land, and then you serve that in the appropriate way. And it's called a notional physical interruption. And if you actually do that every 19 years, it acts the same way as erecting a spike fence, and it will prevent adjacent land ever acquiring a right of light over the development site. Other ways to extinguish rights of light. So you can have a deed, which is a deed of release usually, which is usually put in place when you reach some sort of settlement. So if an adjacent owner has experienced a rights of light infringement, you can have an agreement where a sum of money is paid in return, and a deed of release sets it out. So you're going to receive £100,000 in return for reduction of light of X. Other ways to extinguish rights of light, you can't have a right over your own land, so unity of ownership will usually extinguish rights of light at that point. And then separation, again, it would have to be another 20 years acquisition before the rights of light was acquired again. And then I'm often asked about permanent abandonment and section 203, and I'll come on to those now. So permanent abandonment, there's lots of cases on this. The judges, if you do block up a window, either temporarily or permanently, the courts will look at whether it is classed as permanent abandonment. Now, in my opinion, that is not permanent abandonment of a window, and you should be able to bring a rights of light case against anybody building in front of that for the loss of light. Similarly, this one, and I have been involved in a case exactly like this in Cambridge, where I was acting for a beauty parlour, and they bricked up the windows because they didn't need the light into the salon rooms in that very manner. And we brought a case against the developer for the loss of light, or the notional loss of light through those windows, and was successful in bringing a compensation claim, which ran into tens of thousands. So you can, and that wouldn't be classed, in my opinion, as permanent abandonment, because you can still see the window aperture, still see the window sill. Could that window be opened up again quite easily? Yes, it could. If you had something like that, I'm not sure. I mean, it's a 50-50. Has it been permanently abandoned? We've done our best to. Don't know which way the courts would go on that one. But if you did properly tooth it in every course and have matching brickwork and remove that arch lintel, then I would say obviously you've permanently abandoned it at that point. So once you've got your right of light and it's not been extinguished in any way, what can you do to that window? Well, you can alter it. You can make it larger or smaller and still retain a right of light to the original size. You can change the position. There is a case where an elevation was knocked down and rebuilt 1 metre further back, and the courts decided that the rights of light had been retained in the elevation 1 metre further back because the windows had a high degree of coincidence, and the judge talked about a cone of light going through one window into the other. So you are allowed to change the position of the windows to a degree. And there is a good case law example of ecclesiastical commissioners versus Keno, where the church had a very old church and it was falling down, and they decided to demolish it. And Keno was doing an adjacent development and was looking to build, and did so. And after the church had been rebuilt, the ecclesiastical commissioners brought a right to light claim against Keno. And they won. And the reason they won was because before they demolished the old church, they put timber battens around the window reveals of the old windows, staked them into the ground, and when they rebuilt the church, they put the windows in exactly the same place. And as a result of that, you get what's called transferred rights of light. And because of that, it makes our job as rights of light surveyors particularly difficult, because you might go around a new site, a development site, for example, and see lots of new buildings under 20 years old, and think, fantastic, Prescription Act, no rights of light exist. And there's many reasons why that might not be the case, but particularly one that might come to mind now is that you can actually have transferred rights of light from old window apertures that existed into the new. And what we have to do as part of our studies, we have to do what's called a transferred rights of light study, where we'll get plans of the buildings, old and new, overlay them, and as you've just heard, you can change position of the elevation facing the development even by a metre, possibly more. 1.5 I think is the limit, to still retain all the light on a plan form. And then on an elevation form, you'll be looking for a high degree of coincidence between the old and new window apertures. Given the amount of glass that goes into new buildings, sometimes fully glassed, you can quite easily get a high degree of coincidence between old and new window apertures. So transfer rights of light are quite common. Okay, the other way of extinguishing a right of light, which I want to cover quickly, is by using Section 203 of the Housing and Planning Act 2016. This replaced Section 237 of the Town and Country Planning Act 1990. And it applies to land that is or was in the ownership of a local authority, now expanded to be the authority because it includes other bodies, and can be utilised if the land could be acquired compulsorily for the relevant development. The land has to be appropriated for planning purposes for which the authority acquired the land, and if you can make that work, then the private rights of the surrounding individuals are overridden to a degree and can prevent injunctions being obtained. Compensation, if you do manage to make that work, is still payable based on a diminution basis, injurious affection basis, but that's often much lower than you would pay on a normal rights of light method, as you will probably see a bit later on. The message here is work closely with the local authority. There are some local authorities around now who will fully support development where those developments experience really strict and difficult rights of light issues. To get them to work with you, you usually have to prove that you've been through the necessary process of trying to get people to agree to your development and accept a fair sum of money in return. But if you can prove to the local authority that they should help you and it's in the public interest and you've got planning permission, etc., then quite often they will step in and help you. And Chelsea Football Club, which I'm going to come on to now, is a very good example. But other than say that there are local authorities such as Manchester are quite helpful, Newcastle I know are helpful, London helpful, and so on. There's some local authorities who are very helpful when you experience difficulties. Chelsea Football Club, they were looking to, and you might have seen this in the press, I certainly did, looking to redevelop their grounds for £1 billion development or whatever it is, and they realised that it would cause rights of light infringements to a lot of people and settled all of those claims at particularly high levels, except with one family called the Crosswaits. And in May 2017, the Crosswaits took the case to court and won a High Court injunction to prevent the rights of light infringement. Now, Roman Abramovich wasn't going to just sit back and let that happen. So what he did is he used Section 203 of the Housing Planning Act 2016. And they granted a lease of the land to the local authority. The land had to have been in the local authority ownership, either now or previously, Hammersmith and Fulham in this case, and then took a lease back from them to allow them to carry out the development. This meant that Section 203, with a few other tests, was satisfied and implemented, and that took away the threat of injunction. With this being put in place, the cross weights went even further and threatened a judicial review. But to stop that happening, I believe a sum of money was offered to the cross weights, which they then accepted, which was where we probably should have been in the first place. The thing about this is that the injunction was removed. The sum of money was paid over, which is really where the thing was heading in the first place. The walkie-talkie in London was also settled in a similar way. Okay, so what is adequate light? Sufficient light for ordinary purposes, having regard to the ordinary notions of mankind. And Percy Walden in 1928 came up with the method. And this is what he came up with. If you can sit at a desk and at desktop height and you can look through a window and you can see 0.2% of the whole dome of sky, so we are talking about skylight here, direct sky light from the sky as opposed to sun. If you can see 0.2% of the whole dome of sky, at that point it is deemed to be adequately lit. And that is the method that's been adopted by the courts and used ever since, and was tested in 2020, March, and the judge said, no, we're still using that method. So pretty sure at this moment in time, that's what we should be following. And what happens nowadays, it used to be a paper-based form, which was very, very time-consuming. You have to go through a point and look out the window and see how much of the dome of sky you can see, mapping out all the obstructions in a way. Now we have great computer models and rights to light software, which does the job for you. And what the computer does, picks a point in the room, looks out of the window, can I see 0.2% of the whole dome of the sky? And the answer is yes or no. And nearest the window, you're going to get all your yeses, and as you move further back in the room, you will eventually get to a point where it says, no, I can't see 0.2% of the whole dome of the sky. And it will draw a line. Now it's called a 0.2% contour. Now, to do the 3D modelling, we internally now do laser scanning. So the picture on the left is a point cloud, and that is actually what was going to be the Hilton Hotel in Leeds. Turned out to be student accommodation again. It sat empty for a while when the developer went bust. We take that point cloud, which is a very accurate series of dots, and we draw from that a 3D computer model. And the image on the right is what you end up with, a 3D computer model of the surrounding buildings and the proposed development. You take off the existing building on the site, drop on the proposed, which is what this is here, the proposed development from architect's plans or their 3D model, and then you run the calculations and you hopefully get a more sophisticated plan than that, but that's a very simple example of what you end up with. So the green contour is the sufficient light left, or the adequate amount of light prior to development up to the window. Then you add in, probably in this case, a rooftop extension, and the amount of adequate light drops back substantially to the red line, and the shaded area is the amount of adequate light you have lost. Now, so the question is, when does a rights of light infringement occur? So the courts have what's called the 50-50 rule. If, after a development, a room remains above 50% well lit, there is no rights of light infringement. If it falls below 50% well lit, then there is. It's a rough rule of thumb, because you've got O versus King and Deakins versus Who Kings, where the judge did not follow the 50-50 rule exactly. They called rights of light infringement as occurring at 55%. So we have to be a bit careful when we're in the 50% border. But just going back to that image, you can see the area well lit prior to development is about 30%. It's already below the 50% threshold. So what we have to take from this is that if there is a material reduction in that light level caused by anything, there will be an immediate rights of light infringement to that room. And indeed, if you're just above 50% and you fall below, then that's right infringement. But also the other message you can take from it is that if the room is 100% well lit, such as the one I'm in at the moment, you could take 49%-ish of the light away before a rights of light infringement was caused. So it's not really often about the size of your window and what development you're building and how far away it is. It's often to do with how well windows are at the moment and what other obstructions are in the way as to what you can build without causing infringement. That's very important in city centres because in city centres like London, Manchester, Liverpool, Birmingham and so on, you will have very congested built-up areas, and the rooms at ground floor level, and particularly basement, small basement type windows, will always in general be poorly lit below the 50% threshold. So anything you build will be causing the rights of light infringement in principle. And so you've got to be careful, and that means that even single-story rooftop extensions can cause infringement, and often do. Often asked, is that always the measure of light that you use? Is there no change? Is it applicable to all property types and room types? And the general answer to that is yes. We measure the losses of light the same to rooms regardless, in terms of whether there's an infringement or not. So it could be a school, residential, office, retail, and so on. We do place limits on the room sizes because it's got to be a reasonable loss of light. But yes, generally to most rooms, you would be using the same principles. Is there a right to an extraordinary amount of light? Generally no, it's the same measure. There is one case where I think it was someone was growing exotic plants in an adjacent building, and the adjacent landowner was aware of that and then proceeded to build something that killed those plants because of reduction in light, and the judge didn't like that. But that's the only one I can really find where a right to an extraordinary, a greater amount of light than I've already described has been taken into account. It even goes so far now as to you've got to measure loss of light to staircase treads. A case I will come on to, the loss of light had to be measured to each tread individually as a room to determine whether that fell below the 50% threshold. And again, you're still using the 50-50 rule there, even to a basement staircase. General rules of thumb, outside of the accurate way of doing it, which I've just described, you can just see from these diagrams that if you take 25-degree rule will be appearing in the BRE guide for daylight sunlight. This is just a very simple example of why they don't work. You've got one development here, same size in both diagrams, same angles of light coming in, same window. In the top example, there is a right to light infringement because you've dropped the adequate light down to about 25%. And in the bottom example, you've taken the light down to, well, it remains roughly about 90% adequately lit at desktop or toilet height in that case. So right to light infringement in the top, not in the bottom, and it's largely down to room depth. Which then usually brings the question, I've been heading off some of your questions as we go along here. Well, how do you get the size of rooms? And the answer to that is with great difficulty. We have various methods. We will pretend to be, or we may often be the party rules where asking to do a schedule of condition. We'll be going in to do a schedule of condition, or pretending to, and take room measurements when we're in there, just to get accurate layouts, because that is all important. We will do research on planning and building regs. We will do what we can. We will get sales literature, estate agents' details, and so on. We will get everything we can to demonstrate this. I've just noted there London Eye case, so I just want to tell you how that works in practice and how odd it is sometimes in terms of how rights of light works. So I was appointed by a lady who lived very near to the London Eye, and a development was built right in front of her window. She had lovely views of the Thames and London Eye prior to that, and she was dead against it. The developer wrote to all of the adjacent owners, and there was hundreds of them, I believe, and because these big residential blocks adjacent, and offered them money. And I think she was offered about 15,000 initially, and she appointed me to check the claim and to negotiate for her. So the first thing we did was check the claim. and we got the 3D model from the developer, and we checked it, and we realized that they used wrong internal room layouts, which if you substituted those for the accurate room layouts, there was no rights of light infringement. So I told my client this, and she said, is there any way around it? And I said, yes, there is. You're allowed to change your room layouts. So that is exactly what she did. I gave her advice on how to do that to make sure there was an infringement caused by the development. And she employed an architect to do some plans, and that's what she did. And then she instructed me not to negotiate with the developer. And this went on for 2 years, and by which point every other adjacent owner had settled a compensation claim with the developer. So the developers were quite annoyed, and every time they rang me, I said, my instructions are not to negotiate with you. My client doesn't want your development, and she wants you to change your scheme. She doesn't want you to get planning permission, and she would attend every planning committee meeting possible to make sure you never got planning as well. And that's what we continued to do for another few months. And then he rang me one day and said, look, we need to get over this. What do you think? And I repeated what my instructions were, but I also said, there is the element of human nature here. She may have her principles at this moment in time, but I don't know. If you put a big enough sum of money on the table, you never know, you may be able to change those principles. And he said, how much? And I said, I have no idea. But let's have a discussion about your development. How much profit are you making on those 3 penthouses at the top of your development? And he said 2.25 million. And I said, well, how about £750,000? And bear in mind, this is a 1-bed apartment. And the developer went away and said, I'll come back to you. He actually came back to me within 5 minutes and said, yes, you've got a deal. So that lady got £750,000 as a result of a rights of light infringement. It wasn't a particularly serious one, just by being really, really awkward and digging her heels in. And she moved shortly afterwards, took the money, the value of the apartment, the £750,000, and then moved somewhere very nice. And at this point, what I'm going to do is just launch a little poll. So based on everything I've said, do you think the historic and accepted methods of determining a rights of light infringement are still valid today? So I'm just going to launch that. Interesting to see what you think. Okay, so measurement of adequate light was still weird. So these are just examples of things that you would see from our computer software, floor layouts with green line prior to development, red line after development, shaded area in between is the lost light. And you get a table like this. Then on the left hand side, you have every room. You have the whole room area. And in the green column, you have how much of that room is currently adequately lit. We work in square feet for some strange reason. And then in the red column, we have how much of that room is adequately lit after the development. And the third, and this next column called loss is how the difference between the two. Then we have to factor the loss depending on where it is in the room. So we split the room into 4 zones: front, first, second, and make weight. And we times the loss by a factor according to how important it is. Any light in the front zone of the room, bearing in mind it would be your last bit of light, is timed by 1.5. Anything in the first zone is timed by 1. Anything in the second zone, which is a third away from the window, by 0.5. The bit at the back of the room, least important, by 0.25. You add all that together and you get what's called an effective front zone loss for each room. And at the bottom there, you've got 105 square feet effective front zone loss of light to this particular building, which was in London somewhere. Last 2 columns: percentage well lit before development, percentage well lit after development, for obvious reasons. Anything that's already below 50% well lit and falls lower is an actionable infringement. Anything above 50% and falls below 50% is an actionable infringement. Interesting thing about these tables, not every room on the right hand side is highlighted red and not the infringement itself. You only have to get 1 or 2 rooms in a whole building to fail, and you can then claim for every bit of light that's lost to that building in principle. It's not definite, but that is the general principles we work to at the moment. So that means for if you've got an adjacent residential property or a tower block or something that's particularly big, these numbers can get pretty big pretty quickly. There are also cases, it's called parasitical losses, by the way, and there are also cases where you could potentially, in our case law, there is case law to prove this, that you could have a new building on the same title as an old building. The old building experiences an infringement, and you could claim losses of light, parasitical losses of light to the new building, even though it does not have a right of light in its own case. And there are some good cases to support that. So how do you value the light? So if you experience a right of light infringement, how much should you get? So in that last example, that building lost 105 square feet. I'm going to make it easy for myself and call it 1,000 square feet for calculation purposes. And what you have to do is you have to say, okay, what is the value of light for that particular building? And the answer to that is, it depends what it is and where it is. And whilst you might calculate infringement to buildings in a similar way, depending irrespective of usage, that's not applicable to how much you would value or what the remedy might be for an infringement. That varies considerably. So for, say, a warehouse in Liverpool, you might be looking at £2.50 per square foot for value of light. And in London, in Mayfair, you might be looking at a lot more than that, 10, 20 maybe. But it's usually looked at and calculated by looking at the rental value of the property. The proportion of, say, £10 a square foot rental value that you might attribute to light, you might say is £2. In London, if it's 30, 40, £50 a square foot, the value of light that you might attribute, or the proportion of that you would attribute to light, would equally be a lot greater. So there is a methodology behind it. So in this example, let's say the value of light is £3 per square foot, and we've lost 1,000 square feet, EF said. That gives us £3,000 loss of light. That's for 1 year. But you then have to value that in perpetuity, which is forever. And to do that, you get the yield of the building, valuation technique. You put 1 over the yield, times it by 100, that gives you a year's purchase value of 16, in this case, 16.67. You times the 3,000 by 16.67, you get a claim of £50,000 in perpetuity. That's called the book value. And, you know, a long, long time ago, that's where we used to stop, until Carl Saunders versus Dick McNeil, 1986. Judge said that he didn't think the amount that was calculated on that basis is appropriate, and times it by 3. So when we're doing rights of light negotiations now, we talk about EFZ, which is quite easy to calculate through computers, making sure everything's accurate, value of light, the yield for the building, and what we call a case law multiplier now. We used to always be around about 3, but in the years I've been dealing with this subject, those figures are starting to creep up. In Manchester, recently we're talking about ×5. First time I've dealt with the ×5 for some time in the north. In London, you can get substantially higher than that, a lot higher than ×3 or ×5. So you can see from that, the figures can get awfully big, awfully quickly. So if you do end up in court, there is the other thing that you might have to look at. So, and it depends on case law. Case law is a bit confused at the moment. You've got Coventry versus Lawrence, 2014, where what's called negotiating damages should only ever rarely be awarded. And negotiating damages are what I call development profit or development gain. And that's all about if you cause an actionable interference to an adjacent property, how much of a property causes that interference and therefore would have to be removed, how much profit are you making on that bit that has to be removed or causes the infringement. And the courts, with seeming very regularity, seem to award about 1/3 to the infringed party or parties. It's not 1/3 each, of course. You have to share that 30% between everybody. But if you can see, if you're one person with a negotiating stance that might allow you to use this methodology, you could end up with a hell of a lot of money, which is where I was roughly going with the London Eye case, but it wasn't strictly following the rules because there's 100 other people who probably should have had a share of that and more. Anyway, but there are, so Coventry versus Lawrence says we should only look at negotiating damages rarely, depending on the cases, but you've got various Conflicting cases, Tamara's was awarded on a share of development profit, high cost developments. The judge awarded injunction, but actually said in his summing up that had I awarded damages, it would have been 250,000, which was actually one bang on 1/3 of the development profit that would have been gained. And a similar thing in Morris Garner versus One Step 2019. So conflicting cases of whether we should be using this, but I would say that if you do end up in court, you'll be asked to present those figures as a very minimum, and given the way things are, might have to pay out on that basis. If you do go to court, the starting point is usually injunction, and then for the defending party to say why there shouldn't be one. And the old way, prior to Coventry versus Lawrence, is that you use the Shelfer tests. Shelfer was a court case 1895, long time ago, and just set out the tests that you should use, and they're listed there. And if you can satisfy those and say yes, then you could award compensation instead of an injunction. But again, I repeat, Coventry versus Lawrence seems to throw doubt on as to whether that should be used still, because it said the court should have an unfettered discretion to award damages in lieu of an injunction where the facts of the case merit it. A bit vague, unfortunately, and the case law since then doesn't seem to have picked up on that and provide helpful guidance as to what that actually means. So we will move on to cases very shortly. The various types of injunctions available: anticipatory, before something's happened; mandatory, for the removal of something; interim and final. You might go for a quick interim injunction based on basic facts because you need to stop something quickly, or waiting a final hearing. We used to say the importance of interim injunctions was very important, so you need to be seen to protecting your interests, but some case law recently seems to be moving away from that, as I'll come into. You might have to provide an undertaking to compensate the developer if on an interim injunction you don't succeed on the final. You might have to pay out costs, so that sometimes put people off. And one of the things that really comes out to me, and I'm not sure if it does to everybody else, but when I go through case law, actions of the parties seems to be a very, very important factor. And I'll go through the cases and just really highlight where I think these things are kicking in. So that's all the theory. We're now on to recent cases. We've got Midtown versus City of London Real Property Company Limited, 2005. The case involved solicitors' officers and City of London Midtown were the freeholder of the offices, and solicitors were occupying it as a leaseholder, and the City of London Real Property Company were planning to build a new development, and the Midtown went for a prohibitory injunction to stop them doing that. And the judge said, no, I'm not awarding an injunction. There would have been compensation payable, of course, but the message from this is, was an injunction granted or not? And in this case, it wasn't. And everybody agreed that the loss of light to that property was serious, very serious, and gave fresh impetus at that point, and it does change, we have to keep up to date, that injunctions were inappropriate, maybe for commercial properties. But you have to look at the summing up. The judge said of the landlord, he was only interested in property from a money-making point of view, no present loss due to the lease, had redevelopment proposals of his own, and he'd rebuffed all efforts to negotiate. Key element there is actions of the parties. The tenant, in the judge's opinion, had failed to demonstrate any real disadvantage in working in artificial light. I haven't seen that clause used, or that statement used much, if at all. And the judge was basically saying to the solicitors, turn your lights on. And I think we can only assume from that is that the solicitors upset the judge at some point along the way. So there, the message from that, it was commercial property, serious loss of light, compensation was awarded, but there are particular factors that you need to take into account. Next one, basement staircase I mentioned before, and how you might measure the loss of light. The rights of light surveyors in this one came up with a method of saying, right, we'll measure the loss of light to every individual every individual staircase tread, and treat that as a room in the software. And it means we have to model in 3D every staircase in detail. Now, it's just one hell of a job. And then look at the results for every single one. And the reason they try to argue that in this case is that it was a loss of light to a base of the staircase, and they said that the changes of light or the losses of light below a particular threshold to each basement staircase tread constituted a health and safety hazard. The reason it ended up in court, in my opinion, is that the defendant couldn't believe he was being asked to pay out such a huge sum of money for loss of light to a basement staircase, and wouldn't agree to it. Anyway, it went to court, and the judge awarded or agreed after doing a site visit that there was a rights of light infringement, that the complainant's case was strong enough, and the development was well complete at this point, and the judge excuse me, decided to look at how much profit was being made on the bit of the development that caused the issue, development gain calculation, and awarded roughly a third, about £50,000. So basement staircases and areas that can, again, commercial property, or in this case really a staircase, but no injunction. So we move on to Regan versus Paul 2006. This involves a living room that fell from 67% well lit down to about 45%, depending on whose figures you believe. It's residential. That's an image of the green block is the building as it existed prior to development, the red as it was going to look after development, and what you can see is you put 2 stories on top. And Mr. Regan's maisonette is opposite, shaded turquoise. That's his living room, and there are the contours, live from the case. Green area up to window, well lit prior to development. The red line after development, you can see it's only just below the 50% threshold. That's a view from his living room window. You can see that the sky visibility is, in fairness, substantially reduced, because that's what the computer is looking for, that bit of sky, when it's working out the 0.2%. And the case was about, Mr. Regan did bring a case, I think it was in the county court to begin with, and won, and it was awarded damages, but that was not enough for Mr. Regan. He went to the Court of Appeal, and in going to the Court of Appeal, he sat there and argued that he really needed his light. He wasn't interested in compensation. He'd never discussed compensation. He sits in his bay window and reads and actually makes Airfix models and paints them there, so he really needs his natural light, and he should get an injunction. And the Court of Appeal agreed with him and overturned the county court decision, which was compensation, and awarded him an injunction for the demolition of the building or the rooftop extensions, which were now complete. And that set the principle for that injunctions were no readily less granted for residential property at that time. The actions of the parties again kicks in here. Mr. Regan stated over and over again that he was only interested in his light, wasn't interested in compensation, and saw that through to the bitter end, and did fight hard to protect his light. One interesting thing about this case that I did find out not so long ago is that, and this is all, this can't be confirmed, but apparently Mr. Regan turned to Paul Properties on the way out of the courtroom and said, "I have my injunction now, how much are you going to pay me to rip it up?" Which was potentially his way to try and extract more money out of the situation than he was otherwise awarded, but I can't confirm that's the case. But again, I think in that case there was no winner, because in the appeal, in the decision, an injunction was awarded. Now I know I could look at this and go, right, how much of that development do I need to remove to get that line back to 50%? I can tell you it's not a huge amount. So Mr. Paul Properties would have had to cut away a part. It did cost him about 35,000. The value of Penthouse went down from 450 to 300, but that's exactly what he did, because he decided not to pay Mr. Regan anything for privilege of ripping up that injunction, and changed the building. And I can tell you that Mr. Regan wouldn't have noticed the light, changing the light. The improvement would have been negligible. So I don't think anybody won in that case. High Cross Developments versus Marcassini, Toronto Square in Leeds, is a very interesting case. Did hit the BBC News at one point. on the internet. And in this case, you can see from the picture, a 2-3-story rooftop extension was built. The buff brickwork existed. Mr. Heaney's property, commercial office, was through these trees and across the road. And you read the case, and what you find is that negotiations went on for a very, very long time. And Marcus Heaney was offered sums of money. He never accepted any. And I sort of agree why he didn't, because I've seen the amounts that were offered, and I don't think they were substantial enough given what was involved in the infringement. And negotiations went on and on and on to the point where this development was finished. And High Cross Developments had a tenant that they were going to put in that bit of the property. They were going to take it all, which was a great deal for them. But the tenant, during due diligence, said, "I'm not signing that until you say there are no issues here." And High Cross Developments couldn't do that. So they had a few options at that point. One, offer Marcus Heaney a bit more, or two, redesign, which they couldn't really do because it was finished, or three, go to court. And what they decided to do is, you see that it's High Cross Developments versus Marcus Heaney. It's the wrong way round. It should be the other way. Marcus Heaney bringing the case against High Cross, but you are allowed, of course, to go to court and bring a case where you are the defendant, but you can bring the case in and ask the judge to make a decision, so you can both go on your way. And that's what happened under the advice from the solicitors to High Cross Development. I think they got the advice to do that because the building was finished and Marcus Heaney hadn't brought any case himself. He hadn't really complained that much. He had, and negotiations were ongoing, but he hadn't complained too strongly as things were nearing completion. And it was a commercial property. So I think you can see why they made the decision to do it. High risk strategy, in my opinion. But anyway, that's what they did. And the judge listened to the case, and he said that the first thing I have to do is consider an injunction and whether compensation should be awarded instead. In this case, I don't think compensation is an appropriate remedy. I'm going to issue an injunction for part removal of what's now completed. In his summing up, he did make a few key points in that he thought that High Cross Developments had bullied Marcus Heaney because he used all sorts of tactics to try and push him into an agreement, and also, more importantly, they brought the case to court themselves. Actions of the parties there, I think, are key, or one of the factors that were taken into account when the judge made that decision. And that's where that story used to end. But I was talking to some of the people involved in it. Again, this can't be confirmed one way or the other, but during the aftermath of that, the High Cross went to Marcus Heaney and said, I believe this is the case, went to Marcus Heaney. It certainly didn't go to Court of Appeal, so, and the building's not demolished, so there must have been some settlement. High Cross went to Marcus Heaney and said, okay, how much to give up your injunction? And discussions were had where Marcus Heaney with his advisor said, okay, well, let's have a look at what you would have had to do on a negotiating basis. So let's do the cutback to that development, see how much you would have to remove to respect my boardroom. And that's what they did. And then the quantity surveyors priced how much it would cost to implement the injunction. And the cost was going to be £3 million. And through negotiation, I am told, or led to believe, again, can't be confirmed, that the figure that changed hands was approximately £1 million. So at this point, I will launch poll 2. I get it up as to whether polling poll 2. Not polling. So the question here: after hearing these 3 cases, do you think injunctions or compensation are the most appropriate remedy for a rights of light infringement? Court's discretion, as it is now really, injunctions, compensation, or either, but a more defined approach is needed. Be interested to hear your opinions on this. I've got my own. Okay, and this brings us to the most recent case. Interesting. In my opinion, it seems to follow the pattern of some of the others. These are the basic facts. There's a lot more that goes on behind this when you read it. But Beaumont Properties versus Business Centre, sorry, versus Florala Properties. Florala built into a light well and increased an height of an elevation looking into the light well. So you're talking about an area that's already very badly lit. And if you build into something or build up against something like that, you're going to take away what precious light there is left. FP did offer to settle at one point 150,000, but withdrew that later. And FP, so one of the things here, FP started their work, their development, with no agreement in place. So whilst discussions had taken place, no works had actually, sorry, no agreement was in place before they started, which is always a risky thing to do. And you see some of the flavour of the cases I've just gone through, there was no agreement in place. Some cases, no discussions had taken place and no agreement. So Beaumont Business Centre has sought an injunction or alternatively damages. So the judge in his summing up looked at all the case centred around whether the windows of rooms had suffered a nuisance, and as I said, they were already poorly lit. And what Beaumont Business Centres were going to turn the property into was high-end luxury service office provider, and every bit, in their opinion, of light mattered. And the judge during this case said that, in his opinion, FP, in starting the project before agreement, bearing in mind that the two parties have had discussions previously about rights of light on a different case, the other way around, that they acted in a high-handed manner. And again, I've highlighted actions of the parties there because I think all of the things we can talk about here about the scientific facts sometimes outweighed by how people act during court cases. And in this case, instead of following Coventry versus Lawrence, where you should only really grant injunction, or you've got more liberty not to grant an injunction and award compensation instead, he followed more of the Shelfer tests. Is the injury small, etc. And is it not oppressive to grant an injunction? So he went through those and he awarded an injunction for demolition. This case is still going on because the tenant has to be brought into it, but that was the outcome in 2020. The judge, again, very similar to Toronto Square, said, had I awarded damages, or should damages be accepted, it will be on a negotiating damages basis of about 1/3 of development profit, costed at £350,000. Very similar, in my opinion, to the Toronto Square statement. And that brings us to the end of the cases. So a quick bit about rights of light insurance. Rights of light insurance, and I think every developer is pleased that this exists, because when we do rights of light reports of development, some of the sums of money, when you look at the bottom of the detailed report, are substantial, sometimes millions. And rights of light insurers exist out there to offer to take the risk of that £1 million being claimed in return for an insurance premium. To do that, they will want a detailed report, and that has to include an analysis, really sometimes, of all the legal aspects of the adjacent landowners, transferred rights of light studies, cutbacks to look at development gain and profit, and how much to comply with an injunction. On the back of that cutback might set your premium level, what might be premium level, you've got your cover level. And how it works is that if you get your insurance policy in place, then you can start knowing that any costs incurred as a result of you facing a later claim should be covered, hopefully, by the insurance policy. Unfortunately, what it doesn't remove is the fact that people still have the right to claim. They can claim an injunction and still potentially get your building knocked down. So you have to, you're not fully protected. Financially, you might be, but on the severe impacts of what might happen to you, you're not. But it's a very useful tool, and a rough rule of thumb, if you're looking at a risk level of, say, 20 million, 10 million, 20 million, each development is different, but you might be looking around either £100,000 or £200,000 premium level, sometimes with excesses and sometimes with agreed conduct that you might have to go and talk to certain people which are deemed to be the highest risk people around the development. But you know, premiums of that level are quite common. And then once the insurers have set their risk level where they think it sits, you can ask for a much greater sum. So if you got a quote for 10 million and they thought the risk million was at 10 million for what you all wanted to get covered, and then you said how much more for 20 million, you could quite easily find that instead of 100,000, it's 110. So you can increase the cover level quite substantially for a small uplift in premium. And that's because the insurers have pitched their risk level where they think most appropriate. Through having to arrange or get involved in organising rights of light insurance many times, we've come up with ways of making sure that's the most robust type of policy available, and there are various ways of doing that for the developer. It's a balance between excesses and agreed conduct and the premium. Also getting the excesses, if they do exist, to fall away. Maybe on completion of neighbourly matters, where the biggest risk that exists to an insurer, and that's because you've got to go and negotiate with the adjacent owners, either on party walls, oversailing, crane oversailing, and so on. Yeah, you might get your excesses to fall away at that point, or on practical completion, because indeed the building's been there for a very long time, and if you're not had complaints in that time, are they really going to happen? The insurer would be a lot more comfortable at that point. And we have on one occasion managed to get the excesses to fall away, even though they were meant to remain in perpetuity. So rights of light insurance is extremely useful. What I can say is in all my time in putting insurance in place, no claims have ever been brought. There have been people trying to bring claims, and we've managed to defend them away. There has been one where we've had to settle, but that was because the policy said we had to go and talk to them, because it was a residential owner who was fairly severely impacted on. The insurer didn't want to take the risk, so they said, as part of this policy for that particular property, you've got to go and talk to those people. There'll be an excess the developer has to pay against the settlement, but you have to go and talk to them immediately, get a settlement in place, which we did. But that's the only one that's been successful. So you can see why rights of light insurance works. In all those tens, maybe hundreds, and there probably is hundreds of millions that I've written in reports of potential claims, one has happened so far, and it was not a substantial sum of money. A quick word about daylight sunlight. So that's all about rights of light. In daylight sunlight, what I have to be very mindful of is that daylight sunlight measures for planning for local authorities are completely different for measures of rights of light for under common law. So you might satisfy a daylight sunlight criteria and get planning permission, but cause many rights of light infringements to the adjacent properties. The measures of daylight sunlight are average daylight factor, no skyline, annual probable sunlight hours, vertical sky component, and the BRE guide that deals with them is extremely woolly, and you can utilising that and recent planning cases which have been decided in favour of developments, particularly in London, where you can look to the amount of light lost to similar adjacent properties and say, okay, you approved that one, why aren't you approving mine? And there is a leading planning inspectorate decision on that. You can utilise everything to your advantage to get very big towers causing very big losses of light to adjacent residential properties approved through planning. And that's it. We do preliminary reports just to see if there's any issues. The other thing to say, our laser scanning, we do turn out existing plans and elevations as a spin-off service, because it's a highly accurate method of doing it. And I suppose at this point I'll say, have we got any questions? I can't see any that have popped up on the Q&A. I'll just watch that. No. So I would say, if anybody wants to raise their hand and ask a question at this point, I'll allow you to talk on the system, and ask a question. Everybody can hear you, and I'll answer it openly if anybody's interested in that, if you want to raise your hand. Okay. So hopefully, David, I've just unmuted you. David?
Yeah, I'm here. Hang on.
Oh, hi. How are you doing?
Okay.
Yeah, we can get you.
Okay.
Yeah, we can hear you.
My question was in respect of Section 203 and appropriation. I believe there's some new guidelines been issued by central government to local authorities on the exercise of such rights or powers.
Yeah.
I've only got that anecdotally. Have you got any sort of current intel knowledge on that?
Yeah, we're dealing with one in Manchester at the moment where, if you go back far enough, local authorities used to quite happily go along with the appropriation route. And if you take Manchester as an example now, what they insist on you doing is really getting quite far down the route of demonstrating that you've done what you can to show that you've tried to settle these cases. And they won't just go along, because what they're worried about is the judicial review and the human rights and that sort of thing. So people could potentially bring a judicial review against an appropriation, and they want to make sure that all of the strings of the elements of the Act are in place. And without going through each one in detail, you have to satisfy really that you've achieved each of those. And a big factor is that you have gone through the process as best you can. I hope that answers your question, David. I can give you a bit more detail on that another time. Is there anybody else who would like to ask a question? No? Okay, well, that probably ends things there. So thank you for your attendance. And if anybody has got any other questions, do feel free to find them across to me. As I say, if you'd like a copy of the presentation, then we'd happily distribute it. And thank you.